Welcome to the third Watching, Working, Living podcast. I am your presenter, Paul Carter, and I am joined by my AI co-presenter, Ada Multilingual.
Hi everyone.
This episode is on preventing sexual harassment in the course of your employment.
If you're listening, you've probably been at work and seen the slide packs, the webinars, the online training, the intranet news story, maybe even recited the definitions and key lines for an all-staff call. Reasonable steps, risk assessments, handling complaints. Sexual harassment is unwanted conduct that either violated the person's dignity or created an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment.
Oh, and don't forget less favourable treatment because the employee rejects or submits to unwanted sexual conduct.
I won't, and saying vicarious liability makes you sound like an expert. It can happen at work, at home, social media, travelling, WhatsApp. Your turn.
Oh, third-party harassment? Power imbalances? Alcohol, work events?
Yeah, but there's more. Banter isn't funny if it's harmful. Your actions can be sexual harassment regardless of intent. Organizations need subjectivity, objectivity, fair investigations. Is it even sexual harassment? What if it is but is not in the course of your employment? There is so much to remember, and we haven't mentioned the Equality and Human Rights Commission's powers yet. We're supposed to be experts. Have we covered everything?
You're thinking about what's on the paper when you need to think about the people. Keep the human in the loop.
This podcast is a collaborative effort that does just that.
Let's escape the beige meeting room of bullet points and do this podcast in our style, uncovering what sexual harassment at work is and what reasonable steps we can take to prevent it.
Our guest speakers will be talking about preventing, investigating, and tackling sexual harassment, being a female police officer, and the seduction of power in the boardroom. We have Zoe Thomas from the consultancy Hidden in plain sight.
Let's not think about sexual harassment in the workplace as it's a big monster screaming and shouting and raping the cleaner in the toilets every day after work. You can't think like that. It is people that we know.
Jess Sandham from the consultancy Human by Practice.
Now, the gap between experiencing something and reporting it is usually it's a trust gap. And any training on this topic needs to confront that.
John Walne, a specialist workplace investigator.
Ideally, the employer should identify someone to investigate the complaint who has the necessary skills, training and confidence to undertake the investigation.
Emma Hutchinson, a lawyer and independent workplace investigator, specialising in sexual harassment, misconduct and whistleblowing.
If organisations are going to rely on internal investigators, I'd say they really need to invest in capability. That is a priority.
Georgie Watts, a former police sergeant.
You police without fear or favour. You go out and you treat everyone as you'd want to be treated.
Jonathan Stutz, founder and president of Global Diversity Partners.
Leaders must be accountable to how their power shows up. That means being intentional about boundaries, transparency, and consent.
I can't wait to find out more. Before we hear from our special guests, what have you gleaned from all the articles you have been reading on sexual harassment?
Informal and formal reports of bullying and sexual harassment at senior levels.
Proactive prevention reduces the likelihood of grievances, tribunal claims, and reputational harm.
Discriminatory and sexually harassing culture. The weaponized HR department sought to push her out.
HR doesn't investigate misconduct. They manage outcomes for senior management.
You can be a victim and grope a woman's breasts at the same time. Be careful if you're under the influence of a dental sedative, as that could turn you into a harasser.
Teacher sent dick pics to former workmate, then claimed it was a pocket dial. Police officer who took photos of his penis using work phone while on duty spared the sack.
Nurse suspended over sexual harassment of juniors. 1 in 5 women have been sexually harassed in the workplace.
Workplace romances. Don't let your employees' heartaches become HR headaches.
That was only a selection of the headlines. I think HR needs some sexpertise. There's a lot to do. Let's get on with the show.
Let's hear from Zoe Thomas.
Tell me about Hidden in Plain Sight, HIPS for short, and why tackling sexual harassment at work is important.
So HIPS is a social enterprise. It was set up in August last year, and I set it up after realizing that unfortunately, generation after generation, nothing has changed. Absolutely, we've had changes in the law and we have the most incredible people that advocate, but nothing's changed. But we're still not talking about it. And I do understand why we don't want to talk, because it is uncomfortable and it's daunting, and no company wants to look like, well, we're going to discuss this, but we don't want to look like we've got a problem with it. I understand. And at the same time, those excuses aren't good enough. Perpetrators, they're in front of us. They're in our families, they're in our friendship groups. We work with them, we're on the train with them, but so are the victims. You know, victims aren't in psych units. They're not, you know, on the street homeless. They are fully functioning human beings with jobs, with careers, with job titles. They've got kids, they've got husbands, they've got families. So I think for me, it was really important to make sure that everything about HIPS makes it very clear that we are there, yes, to protect victims, but also expose the predators. I think it's about removing the almost stereotypes of what this thing looks like. Often I kind of mention women because statistics show it's majority, they're more likely to be the victims, but there's also men who go through this stuff, and when you look at how it impacts them, they're expected to take it. They're expected to just see it as a compliment. They're expected to be all manly about it, and actually there's nothing manly about it. It's sexual harassment. So I think for me, HIPS is all about, you know, the main word I'll always say is prevention, prevention, prevention. How do we make sure that the next generation of employees don't have stories that all of us have had?
What have you learned from the preventing sexual harassment workshops that you deliver to clients?
I think what they need is just to feel empowered. You know, majority of people we work with, they're good people. You know, they're good people, they're caring people. They are absolutely against sexual harassment. And at the same time, the reason why people don't speak out or don't report things is because we don't know how to, and we're worried about consequences. And I suppose one of the things that I do with these companies is really applaud them for even allowing me to come in, because already what you recognize and what you get them to recognize is you are showing that you care. It's not the employer's job to, you know, go and save the world or go and save every employee. That's absolutely impossible. It's not their job. But what we can do is encourage them to build those environments where people know sexual harassment is a big no-no in this workplace. We live in an age of cancel culture. A company can spend, I don't know, 50 years building their organization. They can give to charities. They can do all this fundraising things. They can do everything right. Unfortunately, it takes one mistake. It's quite sad because I don't believe it should be like that, but it takes one mistake, one wrong word, wrong interview, one employee doing something, and the next generation will cancel them. Do I think that's harsh? Yes. Is it reality though? Yes. So I think what HIPS has kind of realized doing these workshops is majority of people do want to do this workshop. It's just, I think some people were initially worried about, are we going to look like we've got a problem in the workplace? And you know, that's the job that I have, to explain absolutely not. This is no different from any other DEI or safeguarding training. What we're saying is we're putting these things in place to safeguard the organization, to safeguard the leadership team, to safeguard the employees, because prevention is better than cure. What we've kind of seen recently in the media, because now the media is more open to kind of exposing it, I suppose, is power dynamics in the workplace have to be taken very seriously. Again, majority of people, just because they're in a position of power, they're not going to intentionally go and abuse their power. They're not. But it takes wisdom to say, hang on, I'm a CEO. I should not be texting this employee at 10 p.m. at night. Boundaries are blurred. I'm a HR manager. I should not be having this one-to-one after hours in a pub. But recognizing risk early, looking at early indicators is something that I found employers are open to, because the more they understand and get help with understanding blurred professional boundaries, misuse of authority, informal cultures where behavior goes unchallenged, environments where reporting is unsafe. If we deal with that, then we are absolutely doing akin to preventing cancer by eating better, exercising, reducing stress.
Do you have to change your approach based on the size of the organisation or what it needs from you from your sexual harassment workshops?
The bigger the organisation, the harder it is. And I think that can be for a multitude of reasons, right? I think it can be, how can we get people in a room together? How do we do the training? I think another thing is they feel like some organizations have felt like, but we've ticked that box. It can become like a tick box exercise, which is very disheartening. But I'm very resilient, so I'm like, absolutely not. I disagree. I think the bigger the organization, there's people responsible for certain things, and they might say, well, we had someone come in 3 years ago to do safeguarding, and that covered all these areas. Whereas I go and say, no, but this deserves its own session, right? I had an organization once that was worried about how they were going to be perceived. Are we going to look like we've got a problem? Even if we are talking about prevention, are we going to scare off potential directors? And my mind was absolutely blown away.
Your workshop talks about bystander responsibility and bystander intervention. Can you tell me more?
There's two parts. There's one, if you're the bystander for yourself, which is you feel really uncomfortable around somebody. They're making inappropriate jokes, they're making comments about how you're dressed, or something that I find a lot of people have said happens is they'll be talking very openly about their personal sexual life or things that they do. You personally feel like this is not normal, this is very unprofessional, something feels very off here, and somehow we become a bystander. And I think in that part of the workshop, it's all about saying, again, prevention. Don't be that person that waits to feel like, well, nothing's happened. I think one of the saddest things that I find doing these workshops, or even, spending that entire year doing research into, should I have this as a company, was testimonial after testimonial after testimonial of people saying, and the signs were there, but I didn't say anything. These things don't just happen overnight. Very rarely will something happen in the workplace that's come out of the blue. Very rarely and I say very rarely because I'm going on statistics, right? I'm not saying these things don't happen. It is quite rare that, person A will rape person B in the workplace out of nowhere. There will be signs, there will be a reputation this person has. And I think the bystander training teaches the individual who is becoming a bystander for their own life. Don't be a bystander. Report it. Have the conversation. If you feel like it's an environment where, you're not ready to talk, write it down. Keep a log. Speak to someone external. Have a record of what was said when it was said. So, God forbid anything happens, you can say, look, this is the build up to it. And I think it's all about making them feel like, I always use this analogy in this particular section about if you looked into your bank account and noticed £20 was gone and it was a payment that you don't recognize, of course you're going to call the bank. You're going to say, I've not been on this train journey to Timbuktu or wherever it says. Like, I'm in London. That is not me. Like, I'm sorry, that's not me. And there's this fear that if I don't report it, this thing could end up taking my life savings. It could take £1,000 next week, and then maybe if you're lucky enough to have 10,000 in the account, it will take that 10,000. So I think it's about just giving them that encouragement of report straight away. And even if no one listens, at least it's logged. A lot of the time, a lot of abuse, it grows, it develops in a culture of silence.
People spend a lot of time at work. There can be situations where someone fancies someone else and it's not reciprocated, and the behaviours can manifest. How can employers deal with workplace emotions which may lead to sexual harassment or interpersonal problems between people at work?
Obviously, like, everyone's adults, right? I think it's just about building an environment where no is no. It's really that simple. I think it's just the same way, do you want to have a bacon sandwich? No, thank you. Do you want a coffee right now? No, thank you. Do you want to go for a 10-mile run? Absolutely not. I think it's about normalizing the no and understanding, if someone's like, I'm so sorry, I'm not interested, it should be a full stop. It's not, how can I retry that? How can I rephrase that? Let me try again on that Thursday night. At that point, it is harassment, right? It's no is no.
Some organisations, such as supermarkets and fast food establishments, employ lots of teenagers where culture can be driven by teenage wants and needs. Any advice on how to handle that?
I think it's just about understanding who they are. Yes, they're your employees, but they're also still children. Yes, they've got a job title, but they're still teenagers and they're still young adults. So I think it's about absolutely, you treat them with respect, you treat them as equals to their older colleagues and so on. But you also have that wisdom that says they are young, and we don't want to admit it, but the people that we were at 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, we genuinely didn't know as much as we thought. So I think it's about understanding that. And, is it understandable that companies want to be all cool and fun and enticing to get young people to come and work with them? Of course, it makes sense. And of course, we want those environments where there is fun. I think it's just about understanding the boundary is, this is a workplace first and foremost. It's not a youth club. It's not, a young people's uni hangout. This is a workplace. So boundaries have to be there. But yeah, I think anytime you come to young people, absolutely, you have to have way more in place and speak their language as well. There's no point in going in saying, we don't accept sexual harassment. It's like, no. What does that mean to young people? That means if somebody says, no, they don't want to give you a number, don't give it out. You don't take people's number out of the WhatsApp group chat and then contact them personally. You don't follow them on Instagram. I think it's about adapting your language as well, because different generations see sexual harassment very differently. And I think for the younger generation, they have a lot more to deal with, especially with social media and phones and this new culture of, the manosphere and all these other things they go through. How do we adapt the training so they understand? If you get, a Snapchat and you feel uncomfortable because there's insinuations of some sort of sexual nature, that is as bad as someone at work just pinching your bum. It's about getting them to understand that is wrong.
Does your training cover stuff like Grok, the creating of fake sexual images, dick pics, sending sexual images, and social media following or stalking?
It absolutely covers it. And I think it's just common sense. You know, if you wouldn't send it to your CEO, why are you sending it to your colleague? If you wouldn't want your parents to see it, why are you sending it? And quite often, what you find is people will pick and choose who they're going to send those pictures to. Otherwise, it'd be your screensaver. You'd have that dick pic as your screensaver. We don't. You know, it'd be on your CV. It's not. So it's about, you know, just sort of normalizing. We know it's wrong. You know it's wrong. He knows it's wrong. She knows it's wrong. So the fact that you're even doing it, you'll know it's wrong, but you also probably know that you've got away with it many times, or you're going to try and get away with it. But I think it's just, honestly, it's just about common sense. It's just, if you're going to send it, just be aware that's going to be there forever. One thing we've learned recently with certain things that have been exposed in the media with certain people who I won't give names to, but they own islands, was emails can be found years later. You can't, digital tracing is humongous. So this misconception that, you know, one can send a picture and then magically delete it. It's never actually deleted. So I think helping them understand, if you're going to send it, you better expect everybody in the world to know you've sent that, and that thing belongs to you. And if you don't want that, then don't do it. And also, you know, if it's consensual, do what you want, but make sure it's very, very clear it's consensual. But even then, it's about explaining. It could be consensual, but then what happens when you break up? What happens when there's a dispute? What happens in 3 months' time when that image gets passed on? Are you going to be okay with that? If the answer is yes, then you know the risks. You know what you're getting yourself into. If the answer is no, just don't do it. Before we had phones, well, I haven't got a clue when that was, but you weren't doing stuff like that. So actually, you don't have to do it now.
Thank you, Zoe. Now let's hear from Jess from Human by Practice. Has the legal duty to prevent sexual harassment at work resulted in employers taking sexual harassment more seriously?
So I'd say yes, it has, but sort of unevenly. So what I've noticed is that the conversation has shifted from reactive, so reacting to incidents that have already happened in the workplace, and they've shifted towards more proactive conversations, which are thinking about preventing sexual harassment from happening, which obviously that matters. Whether that's actually translated into genuine culture change is a different question. So we know that the Act came into force in October 2024 and introduced something that is genuinely new, a proactive duty. Before that, victims of sexual harassment largely had to prove that their employer had failed in their duties. Now what we're seeing is that employers need to be able to evidence the proactive measures they've taken. So that's anything from policies to training, reporting systems, and cultural initiatives as well. As the law was originally drafted in its kind of original format, it was a bit watered down. So it was initially kind of reduced from all reasonable steps to reasonable steps, which kind of, I guess it imposed like a lower standard on employers. And some employers have been comfortable sitting at that low bar. But the Employment Rights Act changes reasonable steps back to all reasonable steps. And that extends liability to, so that will also extend liability to third-party harassment as well. So we know that we're kind of moving towards this kind of distinction between compliance risk and culture risk. So this is kind of something I talk quite a lot about, is the difference between compliance and culture. So compliance risk is about avoiding an uplift in tribunal compensation, right? Culture risk is something more. It's asking whether your people feel safe, whether your best talent stays, whether your organization has the trust of its people. And what we've seen is that the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, is now making culture a regulatory requirement in financial services. So in the past, we've seen this. Other sectors do tend to follow. I think it's a really good indicator for where we are going. So employers who are doing this well aren't asking, have we done enough to comply? They're asking, do our people feel safe? And those are very different questions.
How does an employer know if it has complied with the preventative duty for sexual harassment, especially when it moves from reasonable steps to all reasonable steps? Is it easy to understand?
And honestly, no, probably not. And ambiguity, I mean, it's definitely an ambiguous requirement, right? There are some practical things you can do to sense check this. And I think the reason that ambiguity is kind of there is because employers of different sizes may be held to not different standards, but when it comes to tribunals, the expectations of how much an employer is invested in this for a larger employer is going to be much more than a smaller one. So the guidance that EHRC have put out states that reasonable steps will vary depending on things like the time, cost, potential disruption of taking a particular step weighed against the potential benefit. So that means that size, sector, risk profile, they all kind of factor into this. The HRC did publish 8 recommended actions. So this is around risk assessment, having clear policies, providing training, engagement mechanisms. But these definitely shouldn't be used as a starting, as a checklist. So they shouldn't be used as a checklist. They should be used as a starting point. And the reason I say that is, even in some cases in the past, looking at harassment more kind of generally, so beyond sexual harassment, looking at harassment, tribunals in the past have found that employers didn't do enough to prevent harassment from happening. Even though they did provide training, it was found that the training wasn't sufficient. It wasn't to a high enough standard to meaningfully prevent harassment at the workplace. So there is something there about making sure you invest in good quality training as well, and not just an e-learning that you can click through and skip to the end in 5 minutes. That's probably not going to do a lot to change your culture. So the sort of good practice indicators we look at are around: do people feel able to report? Do they feel able to challenge? Do they trust that if they raise something, it will be taken seriously and handled well? So at Human by Practice, we use a combination of surveys and focus groups to not just to diagnose policy gaps, but to actually understand the gap between what an organization says it does and how people experience it. And these can be different things. Focus groups in particular give us a really nuanced experiential view of how people move through their organizations and the kinds of interactions they're having. And there are good examples of transparency done well. So you've got, for example, Kennedy's law firm recently had quite a public case of sexual harassment that was brought to their attention. They've been very open. The CEO stated publicly that they would be personally dealing with this matter. And that kind of visible accountability can feel risky, but it really does build trust. And it does make it very clear to people inside the organization and outside that they prioritize creating a genuinely safe culture. And I think an important framing that I always bring into these conversations is law is the low bar, okay? Law is not the ceiling. The question shouldn't be, have we been compliant? I mean, obviously that is an important question, but we have to try to do better than that. So I think a better question is, have we created an environment where everyone feels safe and everyone can thrive? They're just not the same thing. And we should be aiming for the latter.
How do you translate lengthy legal and HR guidance into a training package that is easy to understand and apply to the workplace?
So for me, this is about recognizing that this type of training isn't really about information transfer. It's not transactional. It's about confidence and it's about trust. There's lots of guidance out there. There's technical guidance, ACAS materials, CIPD resources. There's a lot of information, but chucking that onto a slide deck and calling it training isn't going to shift behavior in your organization. So effective training on sexual harassment has two parts. First, it's about building personal confidence. So helping people understand what they're seeing. And it's really interesting, actually, what I've observed in training sessions that I've delivered is when you do present a situation we've done it through actors or through video content, but you present a situation to a group of people, and there will be people in the room who will see that and say, I've seen that before. I've seen that happen once a week, twice a week, every day. And there will be people in the room that will say, I've never seen that before. Now, those people all work in the same team. So why is that? And the reason is that people will see things they relate with. If you've ever bought a jacket, or if you've ever bought a new car, how many times has it happened where you've bought that car and then suddenly you start seeing that car everywhere? And everybody has, you start noticing it more. Before you had it, you wouldn't have noticed it. Or with the jacket, you bought this jacket, really cool jacket. Suddenly you start seeing other people wearing this jacket, and you're thinking, well, hang on a second. And it's the same phenomenon that happens with behaviors as well. So if you've personally had experience of a particular behavior, or someone close to you who has experienced a particular behavior, you're much more likely to notice it, to understand what you're seeing. If you haven't, then you might not appreciate what you're seeing until somebody points it out to you. So that's something that I've observed happen in the training room. And I think when people start to notice it, or once they've seen it, you've heard the saying, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So people understand what they're seeing. And also in the sexual harassment training, it's about what they feel in the moment and kind of acknowledging the feelings that they're having. It's all valid, and what they can do. The second part of this training needs to be confidence in the system, so that when somebody does speak up, they genuinely believe it will be handled appropriately. So the Trade Union Congress research from, I'm going to forget what year it was maybe 2021, 22. But the Trade Union Congress research found that 30% of women who experienced sexual harassment at work told their employer about it. So that was less than 30% of women who experienced sexual harassment at work told their employer about it. Now, the gap between experiencing something and reporting it is usually it's a trust gap. And any training on this topic needs to confront that. With these kinds of topics, transparency is very important. And I think this is where organizations often miss a trick, is actually communicating a bit more openly about how reports are handled, including outcomes, actually build psychological safety. and creates a more preventative culture. Organizations are often very uncomfortable with this concept, but it is going to drive more trust in reporting mechanisms when people see that their report has led to some kind of change. And the training should then reinforce that as well. I think with any training that is about behaviors, it has to be practical, it has to be scenario based, and it should be sector specific as well. You're not trying to test somebody's memory. It's not like an exam. It's building the capability and the muscle memory to be able to act in the moment.
Do you have any insights on sexual harassment against LGBT employees?
Sexual harassment is disproportionately prevalent among LGBTQ plus employees. And actually the barriers to reporting are greater as well. So the data here is pretty consistent. LGBTQ plus employees experience sexual harassment at much higher rates than their straight or cisgender colleagues. Intersectionality is very important here. Harassment is often a mechanism to enforce gender and sexual norms. The reporting gap is more acute, so LGBTQ plus colleagues may already not feel fully safe at work, particularly if they're not fully out or if the workplace culture isn't actively inclusive. For these colleagues, reporting harassment might carry a little bit more risk, and that could be because of being seen as a troublemaker or inadvertently outing themselves in the process of making a complaint. The Trade Unions Congress research found that many employees don't report what has happened because they're concerned that they won't be believed, or there may be some adverse repercussions to raising complaints. And for LGBTQ plus employees, that concern is generally amplified by lower baseline trust in the system. And this is exactly why training and culture work can't be, like a one size fits all approach. Things like inclusive reporting mechanisms, allyship, or sort of trained individuals that can support with these kinds of issues, and signals of safety for LGBTQ plus staff are all part of what reasonable steps should look like in practice. And actually on that, trained allies or safe people, I've seen this work in practice in a number of organizations. I've worked, I believe in some NHS trusts, there are designated individuals, can't remember the term for them now, but sort of speak up champions who are there to support people if they do need to speak up about a concern. Then those kinds of systems can work really well. It's having a designated person who's very familiar with the policies and the processes and can kind of support somebody going through that. Because actually, as the person raising the issue, one, you're going to feel potentially quite unsafe. In a lot of environments, raising issues carries risks that, whether they're real or perceived, but carries risk that you will be singled out, that you'll be treated differently, that you may even be putting your career on the line. These are real concerns that people have. I think having a safe individual that you can go to and share some of that burden with, who can kind of, take some of the stress out of the process, is generally kind of very good practice. So those sorts of things, when I say trained allies and visible signals of safety, these are things that can make a big difference.
Why is it difficult to stand up for yourself at work?
I mean, we have to acknowledge that workplaces are systems that are generally hierarchical. They're systems of power, and challenging harassment means navigating, a system potentially with very little protection and potentially a lot to lose. Work, it's not a level playing field. You've got social dynamics, seniority, informal hierarchies as well as the formal hierarchies, and unspoken rules about who matters, whose voice gets believed. And all of these things create an environment where people might feel disempowered even before they've considered making a report. You've got to remember past experiences as well. Past experiences shape people's response to these things as well. If someone has seen a colleague's complaint ignored in the past, or if they've seen it minimized or even turned against them, then that teaches them something about how their workplace works. And it's going to make it feel very unsafe to raise things going forward. These are things that stay with us for a long time. And there is also the burden of proof concern. So many employees don't report because they're worried they won't be believed or there will be adverse repercussions. And we see this in society as well, around who gets believed and who doesn't. And then there's, of course, the emotional labor of reporting. So, going through recalling and articulating what's happened in often a very formal process to people that you might not know or feel comfortable with, or that you may have to continue working with, is a massive risk. And it's a significant ask, even where the systems are good, even where they're working as they should. So, when the systems are not working as they should, then it's an even greater task. And this is why, psychological safety is so important. It's the thing that makes everything else work, right? So, your policies and training, reporting mechanisms, they all depend on people feeling safe enough to use them. So, if there is low psychological safety in your organization, one, we need to find out why that is. And often it comes down to transparency and communication, sometimes coupled with high change environments, very pressured environments. Psychological safety can be really harmed where communication is poor, particularly communication between leadership and employees. So you have to kind of understand the level of psychological safety in the organization, and then you have to think about ways you can build that. And a stat that I think is very important is around the kind of the dynamic between the kind of manager and employee relationship, right? So, your management engagement, your manager engagement, so line manager engagement and employee engagement are so closely aligned that Gallup found that the relationship shows up in global data. In every country where they ran their research in 2023 around the state of employee engagement globally, and they found this pattern was one of the most prevalent, most consistent patterns. So your manager can literally change your life if you have a good line manager. Your well-being, your engagement, they all go hand in hand with that. And on the reverse of that, if you have a poor manager, it can change your life negatively.
Thank you, Jess.
So, Ada, do you think AI will ever be asked to conduct a sexual harassment case instead of a human?
Everyone thinks they can be an investigator, like how everyone thinks they can be an actor if they try hard enough. But it's a skill, and the more investigations you do, the better you get. I'm reading the ECHR's Sexual Harassment at Work Technical Guidance. There is a lot to absorb. Let's hear from our workplace investigators John Walne and Emma Hutchinson to find out more about investigating it. Employers must investigate sexual harassment complaints properly. What does a proper investigation mean in practice?
Well, the first comment I would make is that employers should be cognizant of the ACAS guidance on conducting workplace investigations. ACAS, which I'm sure a lot of you know, is the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service, which is an independent public body which provides free, impartial advice to both employers and employees. With regards to an investigation involving allegations of sexual harassment, ideally the employer should identify someone to investigate the complaint who has the necessary skills, training and confidence to undertake the investigation. It would certainly be beneficial if the person asked to undertake the investigation had received trauma-informed investigation training. This specific training will equip an investigator with the skills to recognise what trauma is and understand that the impact of trauma on individuals is not the same for everyone. The investigation itself should have a clearly defined terms of reference. This will provide the scope and parameters of the investigation and should include the details of which policy or procedure is being followed. Employers should ensure that appropriate welfare support is in place for employees who come forward reporting sexual harassment. The impact of a traumatic event can go far beyond the incident itself, so employees need to be aware of their responsibilities. The investigator's role will be simply to establish the facts, and that will involve obtaining accounts from the complainant and the person subject of the complaint. This may also include any witnesses who are named or identified during the course of an investigation. An investigator should plan in advance for any meetings they have so that they understand the complaint fully and know which areas they need to explore further and what evidence they are seeking. In my experience, it is always advisable to offer to meet in person the complainant. Face-to-face meetings allow the investigator to build trust and rapport, and this will help the complainant feel listened to and that the matter is being taken seriously. A person making a complaint of sexual harassment should be given the opportunity to be accompanied to any meeting so that they feel supported and they're able to give the best evidence they can. I would also advocate that a meeting in person is offered to the person who is the subject of the complaint. In relation to witness accounts, meetings can be held in person or online via platforms such as Teams, but it is also perfectly acceptable to provide a witness with questions that you would like answering and allow them to respond in writing. It is important in all investigations, but particularly so in sexual harassment cases, to manage expectations and keep the complainant updated as to the progress of the investigation. Once the investigation is complete, a factual, evidence-led report should be written and recommendations made as to whether there is a case to answer in respect of the matters investigated. It is important to remember that the burden of proof is the balance of probabilities. In other words, what is more probable than not? There is no mandatory requirement for the investigation to prove any corroboration to the complaint before a case to answer decision can be made. A complaint can still be upheld based on a single person's account if it's found to be credible. The report should be written in the third person and avoid opinion and bias. All evidential documents and emails obtained during the investigation should be referred to at the appropriate place in the report and assigned an appendix number, and a full list of appendices should be included in the investigation report. So just to summarise some of what I've already spoken about, where possible, use an appropriately trained investigator, have clarity and scope for the investigation, ensure that the complainant is supported and feels heard, allowing them every opportunity for them to explain what occurred. Don't judge people and avoid bias at all costs. Gather and test the evidence. Maintain confidentiality and document everything. And finally, it's also important to remember that the changes brought in by the Employment Rights Act 2025 means that an employee who reports sexual harassment will be protected in law from suffering detriments as a result of their report.
Now let's hear from Emma.
For me, a proper investigation in practice is one that's fair, proportionate and evidence-led. This means starting with a clear scope, what is it exactly that you're investigating, or what are the allegations that you need to test? It also means independence. The person leading the investigation must be able to approach the evidence with an open mind. They mustn't have any prior involvement in the case, and they shouldn't have a vested interest in the outcome. From there, I'd say it's about method, so gathering all your evidence, not just what is easy to obtain, but all of the evidence. So things like witness accounts, documents, messages, screenshots, any contextual information that's going to help explain what might have happened. A proper investigation also treats people fairly, and I mean this with regards to both the person raising the concern and the person responding to it. Both should have the opportunity to be heard and to respond to the evidence. Finally, for me, the outcome, it needs to be reasoned. The investigator should explain how they've reached their findings based on the evidence rather than any kind of assumption or instinct. At its core, for me, a proper investigation is one that can withstand external scrutiny.
A failure to investigate properly could be seen as failing to take reasonable steps to prevent harassment. What are the common mistakes made in investigations?
Well, my answer to this is that mistakes are more likely to be made if the guidance I've just outlined isn't followed. So examples would be where an employer doesn't follow the principles set out in the ACAS guidance, when the investigator appointed to investigate does not have the required skills and experience of managing such an investigation. This can lead to unintentional bias, a lack of impartiality, and a failure to recognise what evidence is required and what lines of inquiry need to be undertaken. If there are no clearly defined terms of reference, this could lead to the investigation having no focus or direction, and can lead to investigation creep, and it can seem to others that there is no end to the process. It would also be a mistake not to ensure that the complainant is offered support or welfare during the investigation. Investigators need to be mindful of the trauma that the complainant has experienced and do not unwittingly re-traumatise the complainant as a result of poor investigation practices and poor people skills. Mistakes are made when an investigator only seeks to rely on evidence which may support a complaint and ignores evidence which rebuts it. Avoiding bias and opinion is fundamental. No investigation report will be perfect to everyone. Mistakes can happen, and the important thing to remember is that if mistakes do happen, then steps are taken to remedy them. Mistakes should not be ignored.
Common mistakes that I see in relation to investigations. There are a few patterns that come up repeatedly. The first, I'd say, is starting with the conclusion and then looking for the evidence to support it. Obviously, this undermines the integrity of the entire process. Another I've seen is lack of clarity, so vague terms being used like inappropriate behaviour, and they're being used without properly defining what it is that's being alleged, which makes it very difficult to test the evidence properly. A third is insufficient independence, and what I mean here is that often managers are asked to investigate issues involving colleagues that they work closely with without any training or the distance needed to do it well. And there is also a tendency to focus only on witness accounts and overlook documentary evidence, or to accept accounts at face value without actually testing them. Finally, I'd say it's poor reasoning, so any reports that state conclusions but do not clearly explain how those conclusions are reached. All of these issues can weaken the organisation's ability to demonstrate that it's taken all reasonable steps.
If sexual harassment does occur, how can employers reduce the risk of it happening again?
A good starting point here is that an investigation should not be the end point. So once findings are made, employers really need to look at what those findings indicate about the wider organisation and consider what they're saying about the culture of the business. This can involve reviewing reporting routes, looking at management oversight, looking at whether earlier warning signs were missed. The focus really should be on reducing the likelihood of reoccurrence through better systems and clearer accountability. And this is really where organisations can often see the most value. If they're addressing the underlying issues early, it can prevent repeated harm.
If employers do not have full-time professional investigators, how can they upskill and support employees to carry out professional investigations?
Well, my simple answer to this would be training. There are many workplace investigation providers out there which can provide bespoke, tailored training to suit an employer's needs. Training is not only beneficial to those who have never conducted an investigation before, but also important to refresh skills to those who have undertaken investigations. If an employer is thinking about investigation training for their staff, then I would advise that they seek volunteers, irrespective of seniority or role title. Mandating training to members of staff who have little or no interest is unlikely to lead to having an investigator who is fully committed to investigate what could be a serious workplace matter. Having a cohort of staff that are trained to conduct investigations is beneficial to an employer in a number of ways. They will have enhanced skills and expertise, and it will provide confidence to those staff who carry out investigations. Consistency and fairness. Training will help mitigate bias and opinion-based investigations, reducing the risk of appeals and legal challenges. There may well be reduced organisational risk. Trained staff are less likely to make procedural errors and overlook important evidence. And improved employee relations. When investigators are confident and they treat people with respect, employees feel supported, and it helps to promote a positive workplace culture. Employers should always consider the nature of every investigation and whether an employee has the necessary skills and confidence to carry out the investigation in a fair and thorough manner. Therefore, there may be those occasions where seeking independent, expert help will be more beneficial.
Now to Emma, for her view on internal investigators.
If organisations are going to rely on internal investigators, I'd say they really need to invest in capability. That is a priority. This could include things like structured training in evidence gathering, interviewing, decision making. They should also have access to support or supervision, particularly in complex or sensitive cases. Clarity of the role is also important, and investigations should not really be an informal add-on without the time and support to undertake them properly. An organisation should really recognise when external independence is needed. I would say that capability is part of the prevention. Well-trained investigators reduce the risk of poor outcomes and the loss of trust, which obviously add to the reputation of the business and the culture of the business.
How can decision makers determine what the sanction should be for sexual harassment?
For me, decision makers should really start with the organisation's disciplinary framework. Just take it right back to basics. They should consider the nature of the conduct, its impact, any power imbalance, and whether the behaviour is repeated. Consistency is also really important, so similar cases should be treated in a similar way across the business. The decision must follow the findings and be based on the evidence. A well-reasoned outcome will always explain why the sanction is proportionate. I'd say consistency is the key to trust. Where outcomes appear inconsistent, confidence in the system really reduces.
Once an investigation is over, what can employers do to support those involved?
For me, investigations can be difficult for everyone involved, so support really needs to be considered carefully. This can include offering appropriate support to the person who's raised a concern, particularly where the process has been lengthy or emotionally demanding. Support also should be available to the person who was the subject of the allegation. I think that confidentiality is an important part of this, in that information should really only be shared on a need-to-know basis, and organisations need to be clear about what can and cannot be communicated. And that means being transparent about the process and the outcome where appropriate, but without disclosing unnecessary detail or breaching privacy. Teams may also need some support, for example, especially where working relationships have been affected. This might involve managed conversations or clear expectations about conduct going forward. I think that how organisations handle this stage can influence whether people feel safe to raise concerns in the future. And that often depends on both the fairness of the process and the way that confidentiality was respected.
Any final thoughts on preventing sexual harassment at work?
On a final note, I'd just like to raise the point that investigations are not just a procedural step. They really are one of the clearest ways that an organisation can demonstrate how it handles difficult issues in practice. When they are handled well, they can really strengthen trust, but when they are handled poorly, they can increase both the legal and cultural risk to the organisation. From a respect partnership perspective, the aim is to support organisations and individuals to assess these issues earlier so that formal processes are not the first point at which concerns are taken seriously.
Thank you to our investigators. Now it's the police section. Independent reviews, academic studies, and major scandals have established a well-documented pattern of sexism, misogyny, and sexual harassment within UK policing, particularly in the Metropolitan Police. In response, forces are strengthening vetting and misconduct systems and beginning to build proactive structures to prevent sexual harassment rather than simply reacting to it, for a safer, more accountable culture. Our next guest speaker, Georgie Watts, was a police officer in Northampton. She can tell us what it's like to be a woman in the police and how the police tackle sexual harassment and misconduct.
What was the banter like when you were a police officer? Was it ever sexualised? Do you think times have changed and police officers are more aware of what they say and do?
Well, there was definitely banter, and it definitely did sometimes fall into the realm of being sexualised. I think that it's changed in as much as I joined the police and I was the only woman on my team for 5 years, and not once did I feel at risk or threatened by the men I worked with. They're still very dear friends to me and they're very protective of me, like a sister, and it was very much like a family sort of affair. And I think that as I moved away from that sort of safe team environment and started working in different departments, promoting, working across the force, I did start recognising that not every team was like that and not every officer was like that as an individual. So there are some cops that I worked with who are still very close friends with me, who probably would have sexualised banter with me, but there was an element of reading the room, knowing your audience, and we could exchange a level of banter like that. But I knew that if push came to shove, they were willing to die for me if we were in that situation, and vice versa. It was very much like, I said brothers in arms. I know it relates to military and men, but it's a masculine environment, and it's something to be aware of as a woman in policing, that there is a culture of masculinity around you quite a lot. It's easy to end up embodying it in a way, but I think it is important to try and hold on to your femininity and bring that in as a strength. I think with everything that's happened in the last few years, with all the studying I've been doing recently, with the murder of Sarah Everard by Wayne Cousins, and David Carrick being caught for being a serial rapist, we've got a situation where people are starting to pick up more on what's a warning sign versus what's a bit of a joke between friends. And there certainly has been occasions during the 12 years I was in that career of being a police officer where there was sexualised banter perpetrated towards me that wasn't banter. It wasn't funny. It was sometimes at my expense to make the rest of the room laugh because it belittled me as a woman, or it may be for the person that's giving it out to get some sort of gratification from. I think when that first happened, when I was quite young in service, I joined the police at 19. I'm now 33, I'm not more worldly, but I certainly had a little bit of a fear, I suppose, of being assertive and sort of challenging conduct that felt uncomfortable. And I don't think we quite had the words for it back then, because everything was kind of banter or like culture and, put up and shut up. Or I think there's another one which was fitting or F off. I don't think it's like that anymore, personally. I've seen the changes, and I think there's some really positive changes that have happened. I think teams are more aware of not being bullish or leaving anyone out, and also recognising the strengths that different characters bring to the table, whether that's because of their gender or whether that's because of any other things they might have that makes them different from the standard, like, old school Robert Peel police officer. I think sometimes it is on a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and people can be penalised for having those sort of sexualised banter conversations in what they perceive to be a safe environment, but then someone else new has come in and has reported it on the person's behalf that was the recipient of it. And there's been towards the end, there was a couple of times where I had to say, no, I wasn't offended by that. I'm not threatened, I'm not worried, I don't feel harassed. This is a sort of back and forth relationship that we have. Obviously, you have to remain within the realm of professionalism and read the room, know your audience, and I think people have got better at that. But I do think people are so worried now about being seen as having not challenged behaviour that there's a little bit of a quick reaction to stab you in the back in a way. As long as I've reported this, they're not, my conscience is clear, when actually it could be dealt with by that person approaching the person they think could have been offended and saying, were you okay with that? If you were, it's fine. I'm not going to sort of take it any further, but I just didn't want to overstep the mark. But sometimes you find that people will make those decisions for you, so that they've done their due diligence in making sure that no one can say you were in the room, you didn't say anything, if someone was to make that report. And I think sometimes that can create a little bit of tension on a team, because you can be a little bit worried about saying the wrong thing, and sometimes you need that camaraderie to make you feel at home and safe with these people you're spending 80% of your time with.
How would you describe the canteen culture in the police? Would people speak up and tackle unprofessional comments or behaviour that cross the line?
Look, canteen culture always makes me laugh, because the cuts have resulted in there being no such thing as real canteens anymore. I think there's one at the headquarters of the force I used to work for, but it's very much like a drop-in place to go get a bit of food and then head off. There's not sort of a load of blokes sat round, smacking a woman's butt when she walks past. It's not like that. But I think there is still a culture in terms of we're exposed to some of the worst things that people can be exposed to, human behaviour and interpersonal harm that you see. And sometimes dark humour is important to help people process what they've seen, because that vulnerability doesn't align well enough with the masculine culture that sort of needs you to be, yeah, you went to that horrible job, but if you've got another one to go to now, crack on. And sometimes it helps to, between those jobs, have a quick, oh God, did you see this thing? Or, you've gone to a horrible sudden death, but there's been a funny painting on the wall or something. And you try and find things that can soften the impact of that traumatic exposure. I think sometimes that has gone too far, in terms of a perfect example is the WhatsApp group chat that was that Wayne Couzens was in, which, serving police officers making jokes about rape and murder of women, and it not occurring to them that completely misaligns with what their core responsibility is as a police officer. I recently spoke in another podcast for my assignment on current issues in policing for my master's, and one of the things I said was, it baffles me that you could sit there and make jokes like that and then also be the person to respond with empathy and kindness to a victim of those very crimes, and that doesn't have an impact on your dealing with it. Because I think half the problem is when you normalise that, you end up with a bit of desensitisation and empathy fatigue to how impactful that experience can be on a victim. I think now people are getting better at tackling unprofessional comments, but I spoke about it before with the sort of bad apple narrative, where one person is a problem, and if we get rid of them, then we've fixed the problem. When actually there's other theories around bad barrels, or even from social learning theory, where it's, did they join the police and they were already bad, and they've joined the police and they are going to perpetrate harm on people or perform sexual harassing behaviours in the workplace? Or have they become like that, having joined the police, and that's a culture they've become ingrained into? So it's very much a bit of a chicken and an egg scenario of how do you work out where to pinpoint the root cause so that you can then deal with the issues. But I have got anonymous reporting processes. I think generally police officers and staff have a level of distrust in the anonymity of those. It's very often easy to work out who would have made a complaint if there's not that many people who could know about it. And there is an impact on, people's careers if they are seen as a grass or, oversensitive or a bit precious. Then that banter may well continue. Well, I could say banter, but without them present, and eventually it results in that isolation from a team. So sometimes it's easier for people to not speak up and be willfully blind to things. I was talking to someone the other day, and he said people think that willful blindness is a neutral stance to take, but actually being an active bystander requires you to actually be willing to challenge. And I've always said, especially when I was a sergeant and I would bring new people into the team, you're a police officer. Of all the roles where you should feel strong enough, confident enough, resilient enough, brave enough, courageous enough to challenge poor behaviour, that is your primary job. So if you can't do that within the safe walls of your own neck, then we've got a problem. It's also recognising the level. So recognising, is this a low level comment that's been made that the person maybe needs a little bit of reflection to go, I didn't really like that because I have this experience, and to hear you joking about it in that way wasn't very nice for me. So can you just be more mindful? Compared to, for example, the WhatsApp groups that have sharing the photos from a murder scene and things like that. But at no point that has crossed someone's mind, in my view, would that be deemed acceptable or normal. So I think that people will speak up, but I think very often it's not until it becomes extremely serious, and particularly when it crosses over to the bounds of criminal behaviour, which is far too late.
What was it like to be a female police officer? And from your perspective, how did it differ to being a male police officer in relation to culture, standing up for yourself, and raising concerns of alleged sexual harassment?
I think as a female police officer, you are mindful of the fact that, as I've mentioned, it's a masculine culture. And I think it needs to be in a way. And I say that with a pinch of salt because it's really important to have lots of diverse voices within the world of policing to represent the public in the best way. But you're dealing with a potential conflict a lot of the time that needs you to be a little bit like rough and ready and able to, not take too much to heart. And, I've been called all manner of insults by people over the years, but I didn't go home and cry about it and think, oh my God, someone thinks my eyebrows are drawn on. They are, I didn't sit there and take things to heart, which I'm not saying that is a feminine trait per se, but it is a softer sort of trait to have. So you have to toughen up a little bit when you join the police, and it can be easy to be brought into that masculine culture to survive it, and not just the culture, but to survive the job itself. I think it does differ to being a male officer. I think there's lots of different things. I recognise my strengths. I'm the one that was climbing through the window. They're the ones that are putting the door in. And that's fine. It's okay to recognise who is best for the role. And I think sometimes, you see, and I feel desperately sorry for officers that are put in this situation, but you see very small officers, male and female, trying to use the big red key, we used to call it, to put a door in, and really struggling with it, whilst a big bloke stands behind them that probably put it in one hit, but it hasn't had the training, because the training had to be divvied out fairly. And is that fair to put them in that situation? I know that I really wanted that course. I didn't get it because I promoted instead, but in hindsight, now I have the sort of beauty of hindsight to look back on things. There were people better suited to that role than I was, but give me a domestic abuse case and ask me to bring a victim back on board, I am your girl. So I know it's difficult sometimes to accept, you know, that fairness doesn't always look the same for every single person, but it's really important to not put people in situations where I think we set them up to fail. Standing up for yourself, I found very difficult as a young officer. I think half of it was not knowing what was actually wrong. It's sometimes something would just feel a little bit off, and I think, I don't know if they should have spoke to me like that, or I don't know if that was called for, but I wouldn't really know how to challenge it, because you always have that risk of just looking like a hysterical woman. But as I matured and grew into the career, I definitely think that you have a massive benefit of having a little bit of extra service than very young in service officers, because people start to develop a respect for you. Reputation is very important in policing. So whilst you might start on a little bit of a back foot sometimes as a woman, not always, you can build a good reputation and become known as someone that is reliable and everything else. I don't think men have to do quite as much to prove themselves. In terms of like raising concerns around sexual misconduct or sexual harassment, I think there's been some situations where I haven't felt comfortable, or I've reflected on it later, and then by that point, in my view, sometimes things are better left put to bed, because it's not given me some drastic warning sign that they're a potential sexual criminal. It's just made me think, idiot. But there has been a couple of occasions where I have raised issue, and one of them was involved when I was on training. I was training with my sister, because she's also a police officer, and it was officer safety, so we were sort of doing ground fighting, and there were a couple of comments made by one of the trainers that was really inappropriate, and then there was another comment that was made in my ear, and I think if there'd been one thing, just the comment made when we were ground fighting, it might have been okay. I might have just let it slide, but because he's then said something in my ear that also then made me feel incredibly uncomfortable on a personal level, both of us went and reported it to the course leader, and he ended up being removed from the training. That being said, I think probably 7 years later, he was a sergeant, so he was promoted and is now retired. But it's situations like that where I wonder if the culture had been different back then, whether it would have been dealt with differently. That being said, is it fair that I don't think he necessarily needed to be sacked. I think he just needed someone to have a stern word in his ear. And I think as female officers, we should be allowed to tell someone to go forth, and that not be sort of held against us as us being cantankerous or difficult.
What was it like being a woman police officer dealing with the public? Did you ever experience sexualised comments when on the beat?
Yes. I think especially being a young female, you sort of have people looking at you, and you see it in Facebook comment threads all the time. Like, oh, look at her, she looks like she's only just come out of school. I mean, as flattering as it is, I got ID'd for Red Bull the other day, but I'm 33, and I have proven myself at time again in the police that I'm capable and competent, but sometimes you do find that you are facing still quite a sexist backdrop in the public. So it is quite important to recognise when you should pick a battle and when you shouldn't. I think it's similar to officers I've worked with, many black officers who have had racist comments made against them, and you know they become resilient to it, but sometimes it needs for someone else to say, I'm not having that. There's been times where someone's been called something racist or homophobic at the custody desk, and I've further arrested them for a public order offence. Just in a way, not to speak over your colleague, but to show your colleague that we don't accept it either. So I think it's really important to have that sort of support from your team to, make sure that if people are going to pick a fight with you, they're doing it not for a protected characteristic or anything else, and you're on the same level playing field as anyone else would be when dealing with difficult people. I certainly had sexualized comments from people, whether it's someone yawping across the street because they think they're safe, or whether it's, I've had people expose themselves to me several times, and say things like to draw my attention to their anatomy, which was not very pleasant. And it's certainly not the most fun thing, but I think being assertive is the best way to deal with it. Rather than being hysterical and flying off the handle and letting red mist take over. I think in that situation I just went, oh dear, and in a way it kind of helps to re-level that playing field yourself. That particular chap ended up crying and apologising. So I think it's about trying to hold your own a little bit, but don't stand for it either.
How important is it for female police officers to have male allies in the police service when it comes to tackling sexual harassment? Do male police officers need female allies to stand up for them? Should everyone be looking out for each other?
Yeah, I think it's really important. It's a similar situation to, as I just mentioned, if someone is being picked on for a protected characteristic by a member of the public, colleague, anyone, it's really important that everyone pulls together to sort of, we talk about the thin blue line, we talk about the police family. Sometimes that can have negatives with, there's a concept called the blue wall of silence where people have loyalty that enables them to not report things when they should. But by the same stretch, you're dealing with some of the worst things in the world together, and you need to be able to rely on your team. There's been situations when I was a sergeant and dealing with door staff at licensed premises, and they direct all of their conversation at the male officer stood with me. And, it made a big difference when he sort of turned around and said, I don't know why you're looking at me. You want to direct your conversation to the sergeant? And even though they changed, started talking to me, they direct it back at the male officer. And in the end, he was like, right, I'm going to walk away because the sergeant is the one you're going to be speaking to, because she's going to be making the decision. She's more than capable of it. And, having that is really good because he's not speaking over me or doing anything like that. And I'm not having to go, hello, speak to me. So it shows the public that you are there together and you respect each other. So if that male officer that they respects me, then perhaps they can extend that respect that they have for both of us. I think in terms of tackling sexual harassment between officers in the workplace, certainly it does help to have, I've had an old sergeant that I absolutely adore, and we used to have a bit of sexualized banter and things like that, not even in a flirty way. I'd say it was just a best mate in a way, but if he saw someone acting in an untoward way towards me or speaking about me in an objectifying way, he would tell them to wind their necks in. And it's that sort of thing you need. You don't need someone to come in and start quoting policy at you and be like, that's really naughty. Sometimes you just need someone to say, mate, give it a rest, read the room. I don't think that's appropriate. And most of the time it works. I think that people have forgotten that just that simple challenge there and then, it stops something being blown out of proportion, but it also still nips it in the bud before it gets worse. I do think male officers need female allies to stand up for them too, perhaps in a different way. there's been plenty of times I've been on the nighttime economy and females has come and groped the male officer I'm with, and I've arrested them for a sexual assault, because you can't go up to anyone and grab them by any body part, but especially not anything that could be deemed to be a sexual assault. It doesn't matter whether they're a woman and they're, they didn't mean anything by it, immediate tears, but no one goes to work to be sexually harassed, and that's by members of the public and by fellow colleagues. So I think it is really important that everyone's on the same page in that respect, and that is fairness across the board. It would be wrong if that happened to me for a male officer to deal with it, but then when it happens to them, I don't deal with it because it's a woman. So yeah, I think it's really important. Everyone should be looking out for each other. It's just looking out for each other in the right way. If someone says something to me, I'm quite experienced, quite resilient to it. If they said to me, "Were you all right with that?" I'd probably say, "Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you for checking." If it's 6 months in the job, 18-year-old girl, 19 as I was, and someone said, "Were you all right with that?" I'd probably have said, "I don't know, I just feel a little bit uncomfortable." And the likelihood is someone might have just gone and had a word with that person and said, "Mate, you need to be a little bit more careful. You don't know, who might be upset by those comments. And this isn't someone being pedantic. This is you. It's a you problem, not a them problem." And put the onus back on the person that said the comment, rather than that person that's felt uncomfortable about it being made to feel shame or anything for having a normal human reaction to unfair behaviour.
You joined the police to make a difference, but left the police to make a bigger one. If Blue Light Services wanted to hire you to prevent sexual harassment at work, what are your top recommendations for doing that?
Well, funnily enough, as part of my assignment for my master's, one of the things I was discussing was a slightly specific strand of sexual harassment, but it was about abuse of position for sexual purpose. Now, I also studied alongside that police sexual misconduct generally, and there were some recommendations I made within that. Mostly from my own experience, I think the key thing that policing needs to bring back in, and it really went downhill after COVID especially, is in-person training, workshop style, where audience have to participate, as in the participants, where you get guest speakers in who are experts in their subject matter, and where you bring in people with lived experience. So one of the best courses I did was called DA Matters, and it was, really good at teaching us how to contextualize the policies and procedures and, the trigger plan we had to follow when we go to a domestic case. Instead of it just being sort of a tick list of things you must do, you really start to understand what that victim's experience is, and actually the suspect as well, because you're looking at both dynamics to understand what the risk is and looking at it holistically instead of just on a case-by-case basis. So you are looking at it on case-by-case basis, but instead of looking at it as just domestic violence. The same is true of sexual harassment in the workplace. I have done no end of online e-learning trainings on sexual harassment in the workplace, and there is a place for training like that. I totally understand it. If you need to teach us about something like GDPR, you don't need to bring a lived experience person in, or a guest expert speaker. It won't be engaging, first of all, but second of all, it's there's only so much space and time in a schedule of policing to fit in training, so it needs to be really impactful when they do it. But if they could actually start bringing in real cases, and for example looking at the lessons that have been learned from matters like Wayne Couzens, David Carrick, and to see all those warning signs. Just doing the research myself has given me so much introspection to incidents that occurred during my career where I think, I wonder if that actually was an early identifier of what they would later go on to do, and I just didn't know it because I'd never been trained, or if I had been trained, it was a single slide on training online, which ultimately you've got to try and fit in between everything else. So I appreciate that there's barriers to delivering training like that, but I think that the value of it can't be understated. And I think the other big thing is for the institution of policing and also several other institutions. So you look at prison, probation, military, anything that has a sort of masculine culture. We don't need to get rid of the masculine culture. We just need to balance the books a little bit so that there's an ability for people to feel safe at work, and that needs leaders to recognise. Sometimes it's institutional. I've had to go through some conflict in my own perception of policing, doing so much study since leaving, because things like the term institutional racism, I used to think, well, that's wrong because I'm not racist. None of my colleagues are racist. And actually, it's when you look at the broader picture and you consider it from various perspectives that you're actually able to say, okay, well, I know that policing as an institution and police officers and staff are inherently good, but there are some individuals that are able to perpetrate offences or sexual harassment in the workplace and hide it because of the nature of the closing of ranks. And it's really important that that is opened up somewhat. There's obviously got to be a level of confidentiality around certain elements of policing, but when you start denying that there could be a cultural issue, then you're going to miss so many opportunities to stop people who could cause significant harm. So yeah, I think training and recognition of the institutional impact as well, instead of just sort of thinking we've got rid of a bad apple and therefore it's fixed.
Any tips for women who want to join the police but are worried about the headline stories about police culture?
I would encourage anyone to join the police if they are inclined that way. I think it's a vocation and a calling. I certainly miss being a police officer quite a lot. The reason I won't go back is purely because I'm trying to make a bigger difference, and I had two options: promote and become a high-level leader and then have an impact on the force that I was leading in, or come out of policing and try and do something nationally. And so that's what a lot of my work's about. But I don't think they should pay too much credence to headline stories. Headlines are made to make you click on them, to make you feel shock and horror and worry. You've got to be the change you want to see. So if you're a woman and you're thinking about joining the police and you're worried about the potential for sexual harassment in the workplace, I think make a decision about what your line in the sand is as well. So for me, I was okay with the odd comment in a closed environment, just from people I knew and trusted. I would not be okay in an open office of people I do and don't know, and someone making a sexualized comment towards me. And I think I set my stall out quite early with that, so my team and my friends knew like what I wouldn't want put up with. Also, I think a big thing is building in some resilience to your character. It's a very tough job. There's a lot of emotionally demanding stuff that you do, and they are getting a lot better at saying, ask for help and things like that. But a woman that is being subjected to sexual harassment in the workplace and is trying to perform the role of a police officer is undoubtedly going to have a deterioration in mental health or well-being. So trust that the organisations are trying to do better, and that if you do report it, then it should be dealt with and you should feel safe to do that. But in the rare scenario where things have gone too far, it hasn't been dealt with early enough, don't be afraid to make waves. There is a bit of a culture of keeping your head down and just getting on with things. But although you may well feel like people are thinking badly of you if you do sort of raise your head above the parapet, I honestly think that's why you join the police. You've got to be brave and you've got to be strong-willed and know what your line in the sand is, and don't let people step over it, because you're the boss. You've got to have a bit of autonomy about this, and you've got to decide what you are and aren't willing to put up with, and be mindful of what other people are and aren't willing to put up with too. Everyone's line in the sand might be different, and for example, just because that's my line in the sand, the reason it's not my line in the sand when I've got other people around me is because it might not be theirs. So if you act like that towards me in an environment where other people might be offended by it, then that's not fair on them. And it's then not fair on me, because I then have to challenge it. So a big thing is, it's very helpful when your male colleagues don't put you in that situation where you feel like you have to challenge it. And I have to say, I've given you a couple of stories about incidents that have happened, but the majority of all officers and male officers are incredibly good people, and they really aren't looking to try and perpetrate anything towards you. They'll be protective of you, they'll look after you. I was a victim of a sexual assault, and my team wrapped around me like an absolute support circle. So there's lots of different situations where, actually as a woman in policing, you've got a real family around you. So just, I think, be brave. It's really important to be courageous in the face of adversity. Sometimes that adversity might come from within your own station or team, but try and, not let it deter you from the wider policing role, because you might have a tough time somewhere, and then you go into a different department, different role, and find that you thrive. And actually that's a benefit of policing, is that you so many opportunities for you to do something different and get away from an environment that doesn't feel right for you. So I definitely wouldn't put anyone off joining the police. I just want to prepare them for it, to be able to go in and thrive, instead of sort of being shell-shocked by what is still a masculine culture, but not in a bad way all the time.
Thank you, Georgie.
Our final guest speaker is Jonathan Stutz, an inclusion, diversity and equity consultant and author of Daily Practices of Inclusive Leaders. Love can happen at work as can sexual harassment. But when you are in charge, the consequences can be more severe. Let's find out more from John on how power can be so seductive and why leaders have to keep it under control.
Can power and seniority make people more likable, attractive, and charismatic? Are leaders responsible and accountable for the seductive influence of power in the workplace?
Power absolutely shapes perception. Social psychology has shown for decades that people tend to attribute competence, charisma, and even physical attractiveness to those with higher status. It's not that leaders magically become more charming, it's that the role creates this halo effect. But here's the key. Leaders are responsible for understanding the influence they carry. Power isn't neutral. It changes how people respond to you, how safe they feel disagreeing with you, and how vulnerable they may be to your approval or disapproval. So yes, absolutely, leaders must be accountable to how their power shows up. That means being intentional about boundaries, transparency, and consent. It means recognizing that what feels like a casual conversation to you may feel like a career-defining moment to someone with less power. Ethical leadership really requires self-awareness about the gravitational pull of authority.
The McKinsey Women in the Workplace report says sponsors have a substantial impact on career outcomes. Do you think senior men are becoming apprehensive about being sponsors or having close relationships with junior women because of the risk of misunderstandings, sexual harassment allegations, and the damage this can have on careers?
This concern comes up a lot, and it's important to address it head on. First, the data is clear. Women, especially women of color, are undersponsored, and that gap directly affects promotion rates. Second, the idea that men should distance themselves from women to quote unquote avoid risk is not only harmful, it's counterproductive. It reinforces exclusion. It limits women's access to the same informal networks that men benefit from. And it frames women as liabilities rather than colleagues. So really, Paul, the solution isn't avoidance. The solution is professionalism, transparency, and structure. So here's some suggestions. Meet in visible open spaces, use clear agendas, and include multiple proteges or mentees of different genders. And normalize sponsorship as a leadership responsibility, not a personal favor. When leaders follow consistent, equitable practices, this fear dissipates. And what women want is access, not special treatment, not secrecy, and not distance.
Is it a mistake to assume that only men are responsible for sexual harassment at work?
I think it is a mistake. While statistically men are more often the perpetrators because they disproportionately hold positions of power, harassment isn't gender exclusive. Anyone can misuse power. Anyone can cross boundaries. Anyone can create harm. So when we assume harassment is a men's issue, we really kind of oversimplify a pretty complex problem. And we also ignore harassment in LGBTQ plus contexts, right? And we overlook women who harass or retaliate. And we make it harder for men or non-binary victims to come forward. So harassment is fundamentally about three things. It's about power, it's about entitlement, and it's about boundary violations, not gender alone. Effective prevention really requires us to look at systems, not stereotypes.
Should all reputable employers have a policy on disclosing personal relationships at work? Can a policy stop people falling in love or having flings? Is secrecy the issue rather than the relationship, as it may breach a contractual code of conduct?
Let's be clear, you cannot regulate human chemistry. People will form connections at work because they spend enormous amounts of time together. Policies don't stop relationships, they simply create clarity. The real risk isn't the relationship itself. It's when secrecy occurs, conflicts of interest, when there's power imbalances, and when there's retaliation or favoritism, real or perceived. So a good policy doesn't really police emotions, it sets expectations for a few things. One is disclose relationships where one person has influence over the other's pay, performance, or opportunities, and definitely remove supervisory authority when needed. And last, document decisions that have been made to protect everyone. The goal isn't to punish relationships, it's to protect fairness, transparency, and trust.
How can you drop a pebble, create a ripple and a wave to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace? If HR or senior executives lead by listening, how can action do the talking to investigate and tackle it?
The pebble in this case, and really in all cases, is this small intentional act that, in this case, signals safety and accountability. So the ripple is how people respond. And the wave is how it occurs over time and becomes a cultural shift that really follows. So here's what that looks like. In a situation where leaders drop a pebble of really openly acknowledging the relationship or the issue, the second is when HR invites really honest feedback and gives a platform for people to really talk openly. And third, employees see that their concerns are taken seriously. The ripple is when people start acting on that and start reporting earlier, and bystanders who see this behavior intervene more often. And then teams can talk more openly about boundaries and respect. And the wave is as this builds over time. The ripples build over time to create these waves that really is the cultural shift. And these patterns are addressed before they even become a crisis. And repeat offenders are removed from the organization. And then psychological safety really becomes the norm. And really it begins with listening. Listening is the starting point, but the proof is in the action. And that means the company investigating every complaint thoroughly, communicating outcomes when appropriate, and training leaders on power dynamics, and then tracking patterns, not just incidents, looking at the systems, and holding everyone accountable regardless of title. When employees see that the organization responds consistently and fairly, the trust grows, and that trust is really the most powerful wave of all.
Thank you for listening. That's a wrap.
Let's finish the episode with the song Say No More by Alana Jordan.
You rehearse the same old lines like they might land different tonight. Your voice is calm, your timing's right, but I've been reading between the sides. Every pause tells on you, every look arrives too late. I don't need another reason, I already know the shape. You dress regret in careful tone, like it's something I should hold, but apologies grow thin when they're bought out. Oh, I've memorized your tales, the way your stories bend. This isn't something we can fix, it's something we just end. You're asking for my patience, like I haven't paid the cost. But I stopped counting chances when I counted what I lost. Say no more, I get it now. The meaning's clear without a sound. You can keep the rest for someone new. Say no more, I'm walking out. I don't need the breakdown, the answer's written in what you do. Say no more, say no more. I don't need closure, I don't need proof. Some truths show up when nothing's said by you. I'm not bitter, I'm aware. That's the quiet difference there. Say